RokuAka is yet another show that managed to show a bit of promise at the start, but blows through it pretty quickly and spends the rest of its runtime spinning its wheels. It's a show that's fundamentally scared to explore any of its ideas in depth, and thus the entire experience feels underdeveloped. That isn't to say that this show is fundamentally unique or managed to stand out. At its core, this is yet another eccentric or incompetent teacher show, of which there are hundreds. Luckily, they managed to, at the start anyway, pull themselves together and make the most of what they were working with. The most compelling aspect was the magic system, which, again initially, was actually pretty interesting, although it does end up causing a contradiction with Glenn's character later on. You see, in episode 1, we're led to believe that Glenn is incompetent because he's unable to perform shortened incantations of spells. But the next episode, it's revealed that the magic system works more like a command line, with each phrase attached to the incantation being attributed to an additional modifier. Essentially, there's an entire grammatic system to magic which is not properly taught through the education system. So it's not really that Glenn doesn't know how to use magic, it's that everyone else seemingly doesn't understand the fundamental principles of magic, despite being at a magic school. Glenn highlights the importance of syntax and manipulation of magic chants for that single episode. It's never brought up again, and in fact this is the last time we learn anything about the magic system. This is the first of many times where the show will introduce something with potential to be interesting and then completely throw it to the wayside rather than establish it completely. The characters have this issue too. Glenn was actually pretty entertaining in the first few episodes before he turned into a generic blob. He had plenty of good chemistry with his students, and his CEO was clearly having a lot of fun with the role. By the end of the season though, he's turned into yet another perverted nonchalant teacher who's actually more than meets the eye. He has a past which is most developed in the final episode, but even then it's only ever alluded to and never brought into the limelight. Sistine works decently as a foil. She may surrender to her tsundere role pretty quickly, but her lines are pretty expressive and she makes a good duo with Glenn's antics. These are really the only two strong members of the cast though. Rumia doesn't do anything throughout the entire show, which is a major issue as over half of it is dedicated to keeping her safe from the cookie cutter generic antagonist of the week. From the first time she becomes a target, her role in the story is set in stone, and she is never properly developed beyond this single bullet point. She is just as quickly discarded from the story as well. A little over the halfway point, they suddenly decide they're done with her plotline, and she's almost never shown again, despite being a core member. Rel is probably the greatest example of the issues with this show. She's technically the most fleshed out of the entire cast, given an entire backstory and resolution. The problem is that it all happens at the speed of light. From her first real introduction, she goes from being completely disinterested in anything that isn't Glenn, to best friends with Rumia and Sistine, to throwing it all away willingly for half an episode of betrayal, to being talked no jutsu into coming back because of her precious friends. This all happens in the span of a little over 2 episodes, half of which is dedicated to rushed exposition. When this show finally decides to flesh something out, it does so by hamming in all the details at the last minute like a middle schooler writing an essay that's due in half an hour. There's no natural or consistent flow of information here. The show simply jumps from point to point rather than slow down and focus, which creates a very jarring viewing experience. This could be more forgiven if the animation quality were better. There's a lot of action in this show, but none of it is particularly impressive. Most movements end up looking slow and stiff. It feels as though the entire scene slows down whenever a character has to illustrate some kind of movement feat. This is a problem because Glenn, and later Rel, focus mostly on CQC rather than magic-based combat in a magic show. The magic isn't that good either, not even meeting the generic 4 elemental standards featured in most fantasy worlds. For the most part, all you really get are color-coded bolts and summoning circles. It all blends together and leaves a lot to be desired. Magic is one of those things which opens the door to a lot of creativity in its execution, but often it ends up as generic energy beams in shows like this, which is a major shame. They never incorporate any of the syntactic traits mentioned either, which could have elevated some of the monotony of the visuals. Sometimes magic requires incantations, sometimes it doesn't. There aren't actually any strict rules on how it's performed, which adds to the frustration of its underdevelopment. There's an entertaining and somewhat interesting show buried in here. Every now and then they'll throw the viewer a bone and let them enjoy themselves, but more often than not, they're afraid to properly develop anything, which creates an unsatisfying experience. They clearly had enough material, or at least allude to having enough anyway, to properly flesh out the core cast and create something worthwhile, but instead they chose to leave it in the background as a tool to trick you into thinking there's something more lying around the corner. This doesn't keep the viewer asking questions though, it only makes them think this is a waste of time.